that the key challenge in discussing EWS is how do you frame it? How do you frame it? Because there are many ways in which we can frame it. And I'm just fascinated by the fact that those who were attacking reservation as pure evil coming from hell are arguing that it's a multi-purpose good that can be used for a variety of purposes, for variety of means. In which case, why were we fighting reservations all these years? Why did we not discover its multifaceted potential for beneficial reservation? Let me make it very clear. The backward classes of this country are anti-reservation. They only want representation. We have 14, 16.1, 15 as rights to equality only because of the struggles of the backward classes of this country. I use this backward class in the Article 16 sense as including SC and ST also, not as OBC. We've never had a charter in the subcontinent ruled by the local elites or by colonial elites or by other elites that have ever granted equality to anyone, right? It is a new thing. Whereas reservation, Chaturvarnya, is a system of reservation. You do this job, you do this job, you do that job, no one else should do anything else. We heard that argument from the union. We want to divide India into compartments, each compartment doing what it's told, right? So there is actually those who are anti-reservationists actually love reservations. We have reservations for children of central government in Kendriya Vidyalayas. We have domiciliary reservation. We have a whole slew of reservations. I don't have time to list all of them. Have you ever heard anyone say that these reservations are not efficient, will detract from merit, cannot go on forever? Have you ever heard anyone make an argument that EWS will destroy merit? Have you ever heard anyone ask that there should be a time limit for EWS? How long will we give EWS? So you are expressing a view of the not you personally. I mean, your view reflects the love of the elite of this country for reservations, because their whole social system is based on reservations. And the problem is that these reservations are being broken down. And people are getting out of their compartments. So suddenly they are now coming out with their ancient love for reservations, right? And for ensuring that it can be used for multiple purposes. So let me start actually also with reading from the root of 16.4, the root of 16.4. I mentioned this, but I didn't have time to read it out in my arguments. But I will just read out from the famous speech made by Dr. Ambedkar in the first roundtable conference in London in 3031, in which the Congress was not presented, where he presented a memorandum to the conference listing 8 safeguards for the depressed classes of India. And he called them conditions also, and he called them safeguards also. And condition number 4 was representation in the legislatures. And condition number 4 is what later came to be called mischievously as communal reservation. But what he asked for was adequate representation in the legislatures, and he wanted separate electorates. We're not getting into that now. Condition number 5 is adequate representation in the services. And I will read a few lines from there, from Dr. Ambedkar's text. He says, the depressed classes have suffered enormously at the hands of the high caste officers who have monopolized the public services by abusing the law or by misusing discretion vested in them in administering it to the prejudice of the depressed classes and to the advantage of the caste Hindus without any regard to justice, equity, or good conscience. This mischief can only be avoided by destroying the monopoly of caste Hindus in the public services and by regulating the recruitment to them. That's what reservation really is in 16.4. Regulation of recruitment to destroy a monopoly, right? That's what it really is. By regulating the recruitment to them in such a manner that all communities, including the so-called upper caste and so-called privileged castes. He doesn't say that, but he says all communities, including the depressed classes, will have an adequate share in them. And later on, for this purpose, the depressed classes have to make the following proposals for statutory enactment as part of the constitutional law. 1, there shall be established in India, in each province in India, a public services commission to undertake the recruitment and control public services, because the ruling elites were simply appointing themselves through this Chaturvarnya system of reservations. No member of the Public Service Commission shall be removed except by resolution, so on, independence. 3, it shall be the duty of the public, subject to the test of efficiency. Ambedkar was the first one in this country to demand that the Public Service Commission that public service recruitment should be subject to the test of efficiency. He was the first one to say that so these are ideas that have come from the depressed classes and the backward classes, efficiency and equality. Now he says it shall be the duty of the Public Service Commission, subject to the test of efficiency as may be prescribed, A, to recruit services in such a manner as will secure due and adequate representation of all communities, and to regulate from time to time priority in employment in accordance with the existing extent of representation of communities in any particular service concerned. In other words, regulate the recruitment as necessary to ensure due and adequate representation of all communities in proportion to their population. Now, it's very interesting. This is the origin of 16.4, actually, this demand, condition 5. The word backward doesn't come there. The word reservation doesn't come there. This is the position of the depressed classes and of India. This is what we want, right? And how did backward and reservation come in there? As a process of negotiation and compromise in the Constituent Assembly, discussions, mainly because these phrases were taken from the experience of the non-Brahmin or anti-Brahmin movements. Some call it non-Brahmin, some call it anti-Brahmin movements in the south, in Kerala, that is Travancore, in Madras, the presidency of British India, and also in Mysore, in the princely states of Mysore, and in Sahu Maharaj in Maharashtra. So these demands were also against what he calls a monopoly of the upper caste Hindus, which have had to be broken by regulating recruitment and ensuring equality and ensuring representation. Now, this is the purpose. Now, you've taken the purpose and you now want to use that purpose for the opposite objective of strengthening the oligarchy. So let me conclude my initial intervention or introductory intervention by an imaginary analogy. Imagine that the United States introduces a similar amendment to their constitution and says that 10% of all public employment and 10% of all education, public and private, shall henceforth be set aside, reserved for only white people. The economically weaker sections of the white people, but only white people. And no one other than white people can enter there. We can be considered there. What do you think such an amendment would pass even this very conservative United States Supreme Court? Do you think that this would be good for the future of the United States? Do you think that the very elites here who are supporting this, what I call an apartheid compartment being created inside public employment and public education, will agree to such a proposal in the United States? Will they not ask the Prime Minister to speak to the President of the country and ensure that non-white Indian elites should be considered, will be affected by such a provision, and this is not fair, and it is discriminatory and racist? So basically, this is what has happened in India as a result of the 103rd Amendment. Now, right now, 10% of all public employment and 10% of all education, public and private, is permanently reserved for the socially and educationally forward classes of this country, the vast majority of who belong to who you referred to as the upper caste, right? With no entry for anyone else. Whereas, as I argued in the court, and we all know, and we'll come back to this later, but the category of other backward classes is open to any community or any caste, and that already includes communities that are of the Brahmin Varna, Vaishya Varna, Kshatriya Varna, Shudra Varna. It includes Muslims, it includes Christians, it includes, as we know, the Supreme Court ordered that the transgender community should be included in the backward classes. Now, transgender is not any caste. It could be from upper caste. So if you have forward classes already represented in the backward classes, and the backward classes, and I'll elaborate on this later, is actually the backward class reservation is a real economic reservation. And I want to take exception to the argument, not your argument, but the argument that EWS is economic reservation. It is not. The primary condition for getting EWS is you have to belong to the socially and educationally forward class with a creamy layer cutoff. With a creamy layer cutoff. That's what it is. It is not economic reservation. It's a first caste-based reservation in this country, given that backward class reservation is not caste-based. It is open to everyone of all classes, of all varnas, all castes, anyone who is marginalized, discriminated against. Why? Because they don't have representation. And why is representation important? If you read more widely about what lies behind representation, because it is representation will give you political power, and lack of political power is the root cause of poverty and of any kind of marginalization in this country. So to overcome that, you go to the root cause and give representation in the Indian state, executive, judiciary, and also in the legislature. And the theory is, the hypothesis is that representation in a democratic country, representation is the most sacred principle, and sharing of political power. And if the theory is, if that is guaranteed, then the well-being and welfare and development will actually improve. So EWS is not economic reservation. It is caste-based forward class reservation. I'm saying it's caste-based because in my state of Kerala, the left government issued a list of economically weaker sections eligible for EWS, and the title of the government order, which listed the column in which the names of the groups were given, was called caste, jati, and it listed the most powerful castes of Kerala as only being eligible for a reservation. Now, if including a creamy layer cutoff makes it economic reservation, OBC has a creamy layer cutoff as well. So why is that not economic reservation? You have to be a member of a backward class and have a creamy layer cutoff. Here you have to be a member of a forward class and you have had to have a creamy layer cut, and you have a creamy layer cutoff. One is called economic reservation with all this fancy justification, and the other is called caste reservation. If this is not casteist, I don't know what it is. So I think the question is, there is a lot of duplicity in the manner in which this issue has been framed and discussed, and we'll drill down a little more into this as we go forward. Let me stop here. We are very confused about what problems are we trying to solve. Are we trying to solve poverty? Are we trying to solve, when you fixed, you don't have a poverty criterion in EWS. We are talking of economic weakness. I agree this is not part of the constitutional structure. It is part of the criteria. But if you take the economic weakness criteria, what does it really mean? Constitutionally, what does it mean? Let's look at it only constitutionally. The word economic weakness, by the admission of the union in its statement of objects and reasons, we didn't say, nobody has argued that it can only come from 46. The union said to Parliament in the statement of objects and reasons that we are creating EWS to implement 46. What does 46 say? It says educational and economic weakness. sections of the population that are educationally and economically weak, not just economically weak. So you can pick and choose now and just say, oh, we only take, they only take economic, because Constitution doesn't say it should be only for economic weakness. But when you say conjointly educational and economic weakness, that means something. And no one has accounted for how you can disconnect these two, number one. Number two, it says that the economically weaker sections must include, in particular, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In particular. And you've excluded them. When you say you're implementing 46, and lastly, it says that the intervention of the state must be to protect economically weaker sections, not from financial hardship, but from social injustice and exploitation. So how can we accept that this provision comes from Article 46? This is not my representation, it's a representation of the Union, on the basis of which Parliament approved this provision, that it is only meant to protect people who are victims of social injustice and exploitation. Now, all this fits very nicely together in harmony with the rest of the Constitution. And one key issue there is, as I said, that the whole question of 16.4 is not reservation, it is representation, and representation is the solution to what? To a problem of an oligarchy controlling the executive and the judiciary and the legislature. That's not a problem that's been mentioned even once. How do you deal with the problem of an oligarchy in a very diverse, large country controlling the judiciary and the executive? I don't want to name them. There are 4 communities that form the oligarchy of India. Now, is that efficient to have an oligarchy running all policy making in the country? Will they not make policies that primarily benefit them or do not disadvantage them, and not take into account the consideration of everyone else? Is this a democracy if only 4 communities can control the executive and the judiciary? And so you've created a system to ensure that there is diversity in the Indian state, in the executive and the judiciary and the legislature, that everyone has a voice there, so that what we decide there on laws and policies, including amendments of the Constitution, can reflect the life experience of everyone. When one judge, Justice Breyer, who was a professor at Harvard Law School when I was studying there in the late 70s, and I actually got to know him, when he a wonderful, wonderful person, when he, a great professor and judge, when he announced that he would retire voluntarily, a consensus developed in the United States, not to find the most efficient person, not to find, but representation was a concern. We have 1 black, we have 3 women, but we don't have a black woman. Was that an argument for representation, for efficiency, to see how much disposal will take place? Or was that protecting a cardinal principle, deontological principle in a democracy, that all groups will have representation? Why? Because they have different experiences. So I was very happy that after listening to my argument yesterday on the phone, someone connected me to the chairman of the Kerala State Backward Classes Commission, who was calling to ask me what steps they can take to include orphans in the backward classes, because they heard me argue that the National Commission Backward Classes had proposed that orphans should be brought into the backward classes. And he asked me, how will this help? How will this help? So I said, look, the condition of street children, especially poor orphans, I believe the street children who are, especially girls amongst them, who don't even have a family on the street to protect them, are probably amongst the most vulnerable people. There are many such groups, but amongst the most vulnerable people in our country. So I said, if you get them into college and you get them into All India Civil Services, right? I said, we've seen this happen. I said, this has happened in Kerala to a greater extent than other places. And he said, yes. When these people come into power, they will understand the experience of street children because they've gone through that. And they will take initiatives to solve their problems. Not every one of them, but when a group of them comes, there will be more responsive government. So can this country go forward with just 4 communities controlling this Indian state? That's the question we want to answer. Nothing else is relevant here, nothing else. And instead, what have you done? You've created an apartheid space, free of diversity, free of representation. And you say that this amendment must be supported? You're supporting apartheid in the Indian state. There is no other apartheid space. A community that belongs to the Brahmin Varna is not excluded from applying to be made a scheduled caste if they can prove that if they can show that they have suffered from untouchability. Secular criteria around 4 heads: social, economic, political, representation, and educational. No one is barred. No one is barred. You have secular criteria, you apply, and you go in. This is the first time that you have to be born into an upper caste, or Hindu upper caste, or an elite, let's say, the elite Christian community or elite more powerful Muslim community to be a socially and educationally forward class. You have to be an elite. So you've created a space of elite apartheid in the Indian state. Where is India going to go? And why are we sort of, standing on our head to find excuses to justify this? That reservation, yes, in the minds of the elites, reservation can be used for anything because it's their idea. Probably I'm the only one. I told who attacked the concept of reservation in my arguments. Even those who spoke for Youth for Equality did not attack reservation. They simply said that this EWS reservation is welcome. It should come from the other 50%. Arguing on behalf of the All India Backward Classes Federation, the only argument made in the Supreme Court against reservation came from us. And I said reservation is dangerous. What does reservation involve? It involves pushing out people, excluding people. Reservation is a system of exclusion. But what we are doing in 16.4 is managing recruitment to end exclusion. Like you inject a virus to get immunity. Only for that limited purpose. You don't say, yeah, viruses are good, you use it for vaccination, so let's use virus as a daily fix every morning. It can only be given in very regulated, very tiny doses, simply to knock back and kill the virus. This is reservation intended to kill inequality, to kill oligarchy. But otherwise, reservation is not a good idea. No one should be excluded by virtue of their birth. No one should be excluded. And only when representation moves towards an oligarchy will we regulate recruitment to ensure that representation is maintained, democracy is maintained, and equality is maintained. So we are using this to fight equality. But now reservation has been let loose. We all thought that one of the judges was an anti-reservationist. Now he's shown himself to be actually very pro-reservation, because you've disconnected the chain that restrained reservation only on the basis of lack of representation and nothing else. And we have a long history. See, it was from 1930 to 1950. We had a 2-decade-long evolution of this idea, and about a half a century or 3/4 of a century or a century of history before that on how we selectively use regulation of recruitment, professionalize it through independent public service commissions, because we want to end the reservations of Chaturvarnya. Now that the reservation of Chaturvarnya has now been frozen into the Indian Constitution. That's the only issue for us to discuss, frankly, nothing else. And that's not at the level of implementation or regulation. It's at the level of the concept of the Constitution. And also the dishonesty of the language. If the idea was to give reservation to the poor amongst the socially and educationally forward classes, why didn't they write that? Why didn't they say economically weaker sections amongst socially and educationally forward classes? They say other than the classes in 15.4, 16.4. Now let me ask you, how do I or you, suppose you are born into it doesn't matter. Suppose hypothetically you are born, you're born into a family that is included in the list of backward classes or scheduled castes or scheduled tribe, right? How do you know whether you're a member of this class of 15.4 or 16.4 or not? How do you know? How would you know that? Now, every government servant is eligible to pension. Not every, many of them are eligible for pension. Let's say you are eligible for pension. When do you become part of a class called pensioner? When you actually receive pensions, not because you're eligible for it. So simply because you're born into a family, not your choice, that family is included in a class, not their choice, which is called a backward class, and that backward class is made eligible for reservation, do you by birth become a part of that class? Or do you only become part of that class if you avail of benefits, receive benefits under 15.4 or 16.4? In which case, then you should be eligible for EWS unless you receive. But the assumption of everyone is that you have converted OBC into a caste because the mindset is so casteist. And if you're born into a family that happens to be included in a backward class, by birth you are excluded from being a socially and educationally forward class. This assumption is not being questioned by anyone. It's a completely wrong assumption. So I think we have to really focus on the casteism behind EWS and within EWS, its concept, its purpose, its implementation, from all aspects. It is a codification of casteism into the Constitution. That's the issue to discuss. One of the big failings of the implementation of 16.4, 15.4, in my view, over the last 72 years, has been to ignore, deliberately to ignore adequate representation. There are 5 words in 16.4, 15.4. There is backward class, that's 2 words. There is reservation, that's 3 words. And then there is adequate reservation. Those are the 2 other words. But we have completely ignored adequate representation. We focused only on reservation and backward classes. And so there is no, that's why the so-called, I don't like to use the word caste census, because caste is only a feature of the Savarnas. The others were called outcasts, which means they're out of caste, they have no castes. So caste is only a feature of the Savarnas, so I won't call it caste reservation, but a community community census to find out the population of various communities, and then to find out their representation. Broadly speaking, like the Americans are saying, there are blacks, there are black women, and broadly speaking, are there black women in the Supreme Court? No, there aren't. There should be. That kind of approach, I think. We haven't monitored got any of the data necessary to monitor adequate representation. We have completely ignored adequate representation. We have excluded the regulation of recruitment to ensure diversity and diversity at the highest levels, which is where it is most urgent, in the higher levels of the judiciary and the higher levels of the executive. So we now have to focus on representation. We don't care about reservation. We can throw reservations, as I said, into the Arabian Sea, but we only care about representation, adequate representation. Why do we care about that? We care about representation of all communities, to use Ambedkar's words in that draft. All communities, including the so-called forward classes and backward classes. Everyone must have their voice in the government, in the state. So we care about representation in approximate proportion, not mathematically, not quotas, but approximate representation, so that we will have a democratic state. We would not have begun the journey into democracy unless we have a democratic state where the oligarchy doesn't control, so that we can use that state to attack other oligarchies, economic, social, and political, and construct a democratic state. Without this, India will never be able to move forward. If you look at European history and the history of China and so on and so forth, you'll find that when they broke their oligarchies, they managed to move forward. If you take India in a small way, if you come to my state in Kerala, to some extent, we've managed to reduce the power of the oligarchy. We move forward. Tamil Nadu has moved forward. So we need very much to to concentrate on building a representative state. And if reservation is a tool that is now being misused, let's get rid of reservation. Let's replace it with regulation of recruitment for the purposes of representation, a policy on that which will monitor representation, ensure that all communities in the country have representation at all levels, looking at 100% of public employment and 100% of education as a feeder to public employment. And let's forget reservation. Let's monitor representation. And but let's not widen the exclusion of people and go back to Chaturvarnya. So this is my response. Nivedita, is there some aspect of the question that I haven't answered?
No, Professor. That was actually quite instructive. Mr. Panda, if you could just jump in on the failings of the backward classes representation as it currently is.
Yes, so I felt Professor Mohan Gopal has already presented some points which are very much on the right track. Additional to this, I just felt a couple of modifications, including from what he had mentioned earlier. I think in the course of our discussion, it's just become somewhat clearer that the area in which I would suggest a modification is that when we consider the question of reservations and we consider this understanding of representation or lack of representation as the trigger for reservations, we have to understand what we mean by the term representation, because we have seen it come up in the context of decision-making, which is public employment most prominently, and representation in a very different meaning of the word, which is, are they adequately in numbers represented in the distribution of advantages like education, or it could be housing or anything else. I think this is closer, this understanding of representation, which is broader and also encompasses the understanding of representation that Professor Mohan Gopal was mentioning for decision-making questions in democracy. This understanding is broader and is closer to modern discrimination law's understanding of relative disadvantage. So I think it's in terms of terminology and its targeting that we're coming at. Insofar as the backward class reservations go, largely my suggestion would be that institutionally we need to have certain methods by which the identification of classes is done in a manner which does not allow for politically driven identifications, which sometimes get struck down by court. But my point is that it does not have to go to court if we have more independent institutions that are able to do this identification. I'm thinking of a more independent, a strongly independent and considerably secure body like an Equality Commission. And secondly, what I had mentioned earlier, I feel that as time goes on and as our information about groups as well as individuals suffering disadvantage increases, we need to infuse within reservations law generally, including backward class reservations, the idea of priority, which means that there will be some necessity to try and get to those who are the worst off and those who have the highest amount of need for such remedies. So I think these are the two principles, one institutional remedy and one principle-based remedy that I'd suggest.
May I jump in here very briefly, Nivedita, with your
Yes, sir,
permission,
absolutely.
and say that, look, if you read the Constituent Assembly debates on 16.4, you will find that the discussion was polarized between dominant people from dominant classes who always emphasized what is now being emphasized, namely disadvantage, poverty, and so on and so forth, and how to bring people up and give it to the most deserving, the poorest, right? Whereas those who spoke on behalf of the excluded, unrepresented classes, were always emphasized representation as a deontological factor. So let's say community X, right, has no representation, and they're all billionaires, right? They still need representation. This has nothing to do with relative deprivation or poverty, nothing to do even with discrimination. Simply says, look, we must have our equal voice in running this country. Whether we are rich, whether we are poor, in proportion, roughly in proportion to our population, not as quotas, we must have a representative state. And every modern industrial country carefully monitors representation in the state, particularly because you want to have representation in the state policy. It's very interesting that out of the 9 judges of the US Supreme Court, except for one who, if you take by birth, there's not a single judge who was born in the most powerful community of the United States, which is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Not one. One of them has now started going to, is a Catholic, but has started going to a Protestant church. But every single one of them, white Anglo-Saxon, is not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Why? They realize that an institution like the judiciary and these other institutions should be in the hands of people who are not the powerful majority. Unfortunately, we are like South Africa. We're not like the US. This is not majoritarian. It's simply oligarchic, what is going on, because there's a small oligarchy running the place. They're a small, tiny minority. So let's narrowly focus on the question of tackling a problem. That doesn't mean the other problems don't exist. This 16.4 was tackling the problem of creating a representative state, executive, judiciary, and legislature as the starting point of democracy. We don't want oligarchy. Ambedkar in the 1930 speech used the word oligarchy. He said, when the British leave, India will be in the hands of an oligarchy. And it's come true. And so that's the point we want to focus on. And now the whole discussion is being confused because of reservation. So I'm inclined to think, let's forget reservation. Let's call it regulation of recruitment. Go back to the Ambedkar language. And let's just say that we want to make the Indian state a narrow goal and objective. The legislature, the executive, and the judiciary must have the representation of all communities, rich and poor, privileged and not privileged, because we are all human beings. We are all citizens, right? We all need to have voice. Simply because you're rich or poor, it doesn't mean you need not have representation in the state. So now that does raise questions of which we want organic communities, because they're dynamic, they're not state created, they're not created by any institutional structure. Organic communities, they're flexible, they're morphing, they're changing. So any group, it could be a caste, it could be a religion, it could be a transgender, it could be orphans, whichever group wishes to speak in an intersecting manner, we must err on the side of representation and then decide together what is the best way to achieve representation. But let's move towards focusing on that. That's what 16.4 is about. And you've delinked this amendment, and the majority judgments have delinked it. Justice Butt's and Chief Justice Lalu's judgment clearly says that economic criteria can be used for 15.4. This is not an economic reservation. They don't say that, but it's very clear that EWS is not economic reservation, because economic reservation would be available to everyone, regardless of social criteria, purely on poverty indicators, which I said in the court. I said, if you want to give it on a BPL basis to everyone, regardless of social background, you could consider that economic reservation. But we do not have economic reservation in India under EWS. So let's focus on ensuring that that we have a representative state, It is a priority for us. It is a modern thing, a new thing, not a 90-year-old thing. It is necessary for the future. We have no future without a representative state. We will remain an oligarchy, and with extreme inequality and a skewed approach to policy driven only by the life experience of 4 communities.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. So there are 2 questions, in fact, which I think can be thematically linked and really does go back to Professor Gopal's point about an oligarchy in the judiciary and in the executive. Firstly, do you think that the lack of diversity on the bench reflected itself in the judgment? And on a related note, do you believe that the judges had made up their mind on the issue even before the case was heard?
Let me answer the second thing first. I have no basis to think that they had made up their mind, on the decision. In the case of the 2 judges who dissented in what I consider an outstanding example of judging, they were very transparent in their in what was going through their head. They were laying it out to us, the thoughts in their head, tentative thoughts in their head, their reaction to arguments. They were very transparent, and you could see how their thinking developed. Partly maybe because both of them were very, especially Justice Butt, very experienced in constitutional law and on reservations issues, having written very important judgments on reservation issues. Maybe therefore they had the confidence to do that. It's not a reflection on the other 3. But I must say that lack of diversity, this judgment is one of the most powerful arguments why we need diversity in the Supreme Court and representation in the Supreme Court. Why? And I will quote Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the US Supreme Court to answer that question. She made 4 speeches, cost her, if I remember right, almost cost her the US chair on the US Supreme Court, where she said that as a poor Latina woman, I will make a better judge than a white man. I'm paraphrasing. I'll make a better judge than a white man. Why? She said, because I have a different life experience. And that life experience will be reflected in my understanding of cases and my approach to deciding cases. So what we want to do is to recognize that there are multiple groups in this country with very varied life experiences, including the 4 communities that are constitute our oligarchy. Not all members of them, but they are the ones who control our oligarchy by all means. And so they've had their distinct life experiences as well. So if you have diversity and representation, then you have a better judgment that is actually, that reflects the realities of the country. So the view that, reservation, how long will reservation go long? The real question is, how long can India go on without representation? It's been 72 years and an oligarchy is running us. How long will this continue? Is the real question. Dr. Ambedkar saw the regulation of public recruitment. I won't use the word reservation. I want to stop using the word reservation. The regulation of public recruitment to ensure representation, which came to be called reservation in 1604, as a permanent mechanism to be adjusted, as Mr. Lalit also very correctly says, to be adjusted as necessary, not to be dogmatically applied, but to be scaled up when there is less representation, to be scaled down when there is adequate representation, looking at diversity, not so much as deprivation, but diversity, and making sure that's best represented, because you can't have everyone on 9 judges in the Supreme Court or even 34 judges in the Supreme Court. So you've got to, I believe you've got to give priority to the smallest unrepresented communities first, not the largest unrepresented communities, also amongst the in the whole country. So we need to, I think we need to move towards realizing the commitment. How long? 72 years have gone by, and I don't think I've ever seen a judge with the name Yadav on the Supreme Court in 72 years. If any of you have, I'd be happy to be corrected. And I can go state by state, and so yes, I think there is a powerful argument to have a diverse Supreme Court, gender, class, all communities, all groups of people, all experiences. If our Supreme Court is to narrow the gap which naturally arises between formal institutions and the life lived in the country.
Mr. Panda, if you could also.
No, I completely agree with Mr. Dr. Professor Gopal on this point that where it is at hand that you have the opportunity to provide diversity on a bench on a particular question, that should be something that the person constituting the bench has to take in mind. If there were some exigencies that could not provide for it, I do not know. But this was one of the.
Just to interrupt, I was not talking of the bench. I was talking of the whole court. I'm not so much concerned about diversity of the bench, but of the whole court, which will then get reflected in varying forms of diversity on benches. But my comment was about the need for diversity in the whole court. And
yes,
I did not have a concern about diversity of this bench. My concern is about diversity of the whole court.
No, on this as well, I completely agree that there needs to be more representation of different groups on the Supreme Court. This will definitely help jurisprudence develop certain views about how particular bodies of law can develop to actually meet their aims. I thought I should just mention, I don't know whether this will result in accentuating the disagreement in any further, but Professor had already mentioned about how he viewed this question of deprivation and representation somewhat distinctly. Because I felt that I was already in agreement with him on this point. It was just that I was trying to talk about a wider understanding of representation that also encompassed his idea of representation. And that's where I was coming from. But I can see that there are some ways of looking at the question of representation that is completely dealing from the question of disadvantage. And I don't mean just material disadvantage. I mean, even disadvantage in terms of the opportunity to participate in decision making. This is also a disadvantage. Even if one on basis of evidence shows that some people do not have access to enter into decision making spaces, that is a kind of deprivation and disadvantage as well to me. And I think this brings us somewhat on the same page. I'm not wrong. Yeah.
No, I see. It's a vicious circle with chicken and egg situation. Does representation lead to deprivation, or deprivation lead to lack of representation? But I think what Dr. Ambedkar did in 1930 was to focus narrowly on the need that we must have representation of all communities to begin with, and then assume that will provide a basis for identifying and addressing deprivation. Now we've got an oligarchy defining opportunistically deprivation, representation, democracy, reservation. They say for many years reservation is the greatest evil on earth. And now they're all going around saying reservation is a fantastic tool that should be used for all kinds of purposes, right? This is completely opportunistic and dishonest. So, let's agree on, I think, and ultimately we want all kinds of, see, you know that there are multiple ways of defining the word economic. And one of those ways is to understand the word economic in terms of welfare and well-being, and look at economic as dealing with all the lack of access to all the prerequisites for well-being, right? Include social, educational, economic input. That's why I say reservation for backward classes is the real economic reservation of our country, not financial reservation, but economic reservation. We already have it. But the so-called members of the so-called forward classes are already in that group. If there were any group left, if there was any group left out that was not getting that reservation, there was nothing preventing them from being brought into the backward class group. Why did they create EWS? Right. So creation of EWS may tell us a hypothesis that there are no more groups amongst the forward classes that are marginalized or unrepresented. Because if there were such groups, they would already have been included, like many Brahmin and Vaishya and other communities in BC. So we're now dealing only with individual deprivation, right? Individual financial difficulty. This is another, maybe last important point I want to make, because when you look at the attitude of the forward classes, They love reservation. They are the inventors of reservation. It's their system. But there's only one reservation that they oppose and they hate, and that is reservation for socially and educationally, for basically lower castes. They don't like that. Why is that? Because that is a group reservation for those who are, let's use their own terminology, they see it as group reservation for the lower castes. What will group reservation for the lower castes do? It will reinforce their identity. It will help to build their solidarity, build their organization, and strengthen their groups. Because Dr. Ambedkar and others believed that they were poor because their groups were attacked and destroyed as a group. So as Hannah Arendt said, if you attack me as a Jew, I will respond as a Jew. If you attack me as a woman, I'll respond as a woman, right? So they were attacked as groups. So they have to respond to that attack as groups and strengthen themselves. So that's one of the most remarkable contributions of Dr. Ambedkar to the struggle for equality worldwide, was to write into the Indian Constitution, something not present in the American or any other constitution, a constitutional principle as a fundamental right that all classes, not individuals, are entitled to adequate representation. Communities are entitled to adequate representation, to use the 1930 language. Incredibly innovative idea to bring about democratic change. Now, it has been a great objective of the dominant oligarchy to prevent this from happening and weaken and destroy these groups. And economic reservation is only a name for a tool that will ensure that groups will not consolidate. So we'll give you a reservation, but as an individual, not as a member of a group. And so your group will not strengthen. So basically what we are seeing is one part of a larger attempt to attack and weaken the groups of lower classes and lower castes from being able to mobilize and solidify, when the groups of the upper caste, so we had a deputy chief minister's wife proudly, and not isolated, say, proud to be member of my social group, right? And those groups are strong. They're getting stronger by the day. They're being reinforced, and you're destroying the others so that you can atomize these people, right? Through switching to not economic reservation versus backward class reservation, but individual reservation versus group reservation, right? So that the individual reservation will be a tool of atomizing these people. So at the end of the day, this is not only this is part of the attempt to prevent social change by democratizing power, by transferring power from an oligarchy to all communities of people. But one way to do that is to atomize through individual reservations rather than reservation for weak groups, so that they can get strong and individuals amongst them can also get strong. And so we must understand this context as well. This is not about efficiency. It's not about simply constitutional law. It is about maintaining an oligarchic society without change. They've managed to do that for 72 years. Individuals may have escaped poverty, and they will permit that to happen, but they will never allow the marginalized groups to ever emerge as powerful groups in this country. And to realize the constitutional vision in the directive principles that there shall be equality not only amongst individuals, but also amongst groups.
Thank you, Professor. I think this has been an incredibly fruitful, very instructive and informative session. Professor Gopal's comments on the idea of representation in a social democracy such as ours, or at least what we aspire to, as well as Mr. Panda's comments on whether there is an alternative imagination for the EWS in a way that we can prevent misuse of reservation as a tool for majoritarianism. Thank you both for attending this session, taking time out of your busy schedule on a Sunday evening. And thank you to all our participants for taking part in this. This session is being recorded and will be up on YouTube in the coming days. And with that, we would like to close the session. Thank you again.
Let me express appreciation for Mr. Panda's interventions. They were really excellent. He has a very open and balanced mind, and I've learned from a number of things he said, and I hope we can together interact further and try to evolve in a direction that will ensure that we all have voice in how this country is run. Everyone. We are not against anyone. We are for representation for everyone. And in the faith, not only deontologically, but also in the belief that that is the only way in which we can have a better future economically, socially, and politically in our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I was also equally moved, despite having come from a position where I was somewhat suspicious about the ways in which the petitioners had presented the argument. I've been quite deeply moved by the concept of representative democracy that you presented as a backdrop for reservations. I think it's a different way that I had not really wrapped my head around. But yeah, thank you so much for your kind words.
You're very welcome. And Nivedita, compliments to you for organizing all this with a lot of discipline and rigor, and well done.
Thank you, sir.